In March, I released a video about what if we had 1914 borders in the modern world, changing nothing but the borders while keeping GDP and population figures the same. From here, we do the math and calculate the new population of the reformed states. In this episode, we change the borders from the modern day to 1939, where as some of the most highlighted changes, we have a rising German Empire, a reformed British Empire, the Soviet Union reunited, and the Japanese in the middle of an invasion of China. Let's see how these nations change the population and GDP distribution of the world. Let's start off with a bang and discuss the changes within Germany, regaining their eastern lands, annexing Austria and Czechia, while controlling a puppet regime in Slovakia. All in all, this new German Empire is significantly larger than it is today. In terms of population, we see the German Empire jump from around 80 million to 120 million, a very significant 50% jump. Within this German Empire, around 75% of the population is German, while 25% is Western Slavic, with significant Polish and Czech populations. The GDP jump isn't as pronounced, as the German economy is massive already, going from 4.2 trillion to 5.4 trillion. That's still a large jump, but Germany alone still dominates the GDP chart, with fellow Germanic Austria having another 10%. Meaning that the 25% of the Slavic population only has about 10% of the economy. It would only seem fair to move east next to discuss Poland itself, which has lost quite a bit of land out west, but did regain a bunch in the east at the expense of Ukraine, Lithuania and Belarus. Does this compensate? No. In terms of GDP, Poland loses around 30% of their output, as their rich western provinces are replaced with territory in just about the poorest region of Europe. In terms of population too, the Poles see a 17% drop, while their population makeup changes significantly, with around a quarter of the population now being Eastern Slavs from Ukraine or Belarus, and even 4% being Lithuanians from Vilnius. Speaking of Lithuania, they deserve a quick mention for losing around half of their GDP to Poland, due to the loss of their capital, while also losing around a third of their population. A truly devastating loss for the small state. Nearby Romania also finally sees union with Moldova and gains minor territories back from Ukraine. The unification of Romania and Moldova is one of the few actually possible changes you'll see in this video. The Romanian population grows by 20%, while their economy only grows by a disappointing 5%. Again, there is quite little to gain from expansion in this part of Europe. But let's zoom out from Europe and see some global empires, with first the US to discuss, which is a very interesting case. On the map, they change very little, only gaining the Philippines and some Pacific islands, but their population explodes with 150 million Filipinos now reintegrated into America. That's a 33% boost, meaning that almost a quarter of America's population now lives in the Philippines. This is a radical change from real-life 1939, when the Philippines accounted for only 10% of the American population. In terms of GDP though, pretty much nothing has changed, with only a 2% increase for the Americans, showing the immense wealth difference between the regions. Next up, the British Empire, the true behemoth of the era. Safe to say, their changes are massive, as I will not count just their direct colonies, I will also still include their dominions, despite their semi-independence at this point. In terms of population, this new British Empire is frankly insane. They annex India, Pakistan, Nigeria and Bangladesh, all of which are already in the top 10 most populated states on their own. This easily propels Britain to the top, as together with their various other colonies, they now have a population of 2.8 billion, meaning that Britain controls around 35% of all people on Earth. Compared to actual 1939, Britain only controlled 25% of the people on Earth. This discrepancy can mainly be explained by massive population growth in Africa during this period. Britain's population as a whole jumps by 42 times. Internally, Britain and their Anglo dominions only make up around 5% of the population. Arabs make up 6%, Sub-Saharan Africans 20%, and finally, people from the Indian subcontinent dominate easily with 66% of the population. Back in 1939, this was significantly different, as the Indians made up an even larger 70% of the population, but the Anglos still held 13% of the empire at this time, as Africa was significantly less populated. In terms of GDP, the jump is significantly less impactful, with Britain's GDP only growing by 5 times. Still a lot, but not anywhere near what I'd expect. Britain itself still holds 22% of the economy of the empire, while the developed former dominions hold around 28%. This means that the 5% Anglo population of the empire holds around 50% of the empire's economic output, which is frankly insane. The 66% of the population in the Indian subcontinent only holds around 27% of the economy. Sorry for the quick intermission, but most of you aren't subscribed. To keep up to date with the 2 videos I release every single week, consider doing so. Thank you. 2 states that most wouldn't give much thought to are the Dutch and the Belgians. But by regaining Indonesia and the Congo respectively, they are both massively altered. The Dutch first, they are very unique, because they are the only state which has become dominated by their former colony, both economically and in terms of population. With a GDP jump of 118%, Indonesia now holds around 50% of the economy of the new empire. Still, that doesn't even light a candle to the population domination of the colony, as a whopping 94% of the empire now resides in Indonesia. Belgium is a different and quite tragic story. Their new colony is one of the poorest regions on Earth, and Belgium one of the richest. Belgium's population increases tenfold, as 90% of their population now lives in Africa, but their economy, in the reverse, remains mostly in Europe, with only 10% of their economic output residing in Congo. This situation was radically different in 1939, when around 40% of the empire lived in Europe, with the Congo only accounting for 60%. Still a majority, but not the absolute domination which we see today. Over in Asia, we have 2 radically changed states, in Japan and China. Japan was busy with their invasion, and in doing so, occupied most cities in eastern China, which just so happened to be the richest regions of the nation. China's GDP takes a massive 75% hit, as most economic activity resides in these coastal cities now under Japan's control. The population drop isn't as bad, as only 45% are lost, but even that is a catastrophic decline. And all of this goes to Japan's benefit. Their economy grows by 4-fold, from 5 trillion to 20 trillion, mostly due to gaining these regions in mainland China, but the output of Taiwan and South Korea are also noticeable. In terms of population, Japan jumps from 125 million to an astounding 840. Most of the population of this new state, obviously, is Chinese at 75%, with Japan itself making up 15%. The remainder is left over for the Koreans at around 10% of the population. Back in 1939, the Japanese were slightly more populous at around 25% of the empire, while the Chinese held 68% and the remaining 7% was Korean. Let's now knock off Portugal real quick, which regained Angola and Mozambique. They follow your typical colonial story, a massive population jump from 10 million to 80 million, with about 88% of the population now residing in Africa. In terms of economy though, even the middling economy of Portugal remains dominant over their colonies, with 66% of output in Portugal, with the African colonies only taking 26%. The remaining 8% can be found in Macau, Portugal's concession in China, which only holds 1% of the population, but is fabulously wealthy compared to the rest. Back in 1939, the Portuguese still made up 40% of their empire's population, again showing the radical population growth of Africa. Back in Europe, we also have Serbia reforge Yugoslavia. Their population would increase from 6 million up to 20, wherein 40% of the nation is Serbian, 20% is Croatian, and the other nationalities each make up roughly 10%. Serbia's economic growth is also large, increasing from 63 billion to 230 billion. Then we still have a couple of major states left. France has their insane colonial empire restored. A jump of 475 million people suddenly turns France into one of the most populated empires in the world. The distribution of this population is actually quite interesting. Sub-Saharan Africans make up 43% of the people, followed by Indochina and Arab states, both at 22%, with only a 12% minority living in metropolitan France. These figures were radically different in 1939, as the French still made up a plurality at 40% of the population, with Africa dropping down to 21% and the others remaining relatively stable. Again, Africa's population change has been insane over this time period. So, how much does the economic value of France's empire grow the economy? A very, very disappointing 1.1 trillion is added, only a 33% increase, as France themselves still account for 75% of their empire's economy. Now the final colonial power to discuss is Italy, which has a decent empire centering around Ethiopia. Italy's population jumped from 60 to 210 million, with the 120 million Ethiopians now holding a majority within the nation, as 2/3 of the empire now resides in East Africa and only around 30% of the population is in Italy. This is a major shift from real 1939, when Italians made up 75% of their own empire. Economically, Italy's renewed empire is very lackluster though, only growing by around 200 billion, a 9% increase, as 92% of the empire's economy remains in Italy. The final nation to discuss is the reformed Soviet Union. While not as big as the Union would eventually be, it's still a massive expansion for Russia. Their population doubles from 145 million to 290 million. Within this union, Eastern Slavs make up around 2/3 of the population, with significant Central Asian and Turkic minorities. Economically though, the Russians, so not even including the Eastern Slavs of Ukraine and Belarus, hold 75% of the GDP of the nation, as Russia's total economic output only grew by around 33%, showing just how poor most of the post-Soviet states have become. With that, we have covered all nations, as most of the remaining states either haven't changed at all, or have changed so little that mentioning them is just a waste of time. Let's now dive into some top 10 lists and then compare the relative power of the Axis and the Allies. Let's first look at the top 10 GDP of our own timeline, which should be relatively familiar to most. Now considering that 3 of these nations no longer exist, this list will change quite radically. Number 1 remains the US with a slightly larger GDP. Their behemoth economy is so insane, even the British, with 2.8 billion people, don't come close. In fact, it's Japan that becomes number 2, which makes a lot of sense, considering they were already the 3rd largest economy and have cannibalized China, the number 2. At number 3, we have the British, who jump an impressive 3 spaces. Logical, considering they integrated 3 of the top 10 economies. 4th remains Germany, who just managed to remain ahead of the crippled Chinese economy. As the final economy above 4 trillion, we have the French. From here, we need to jump down significantly to find the Soviets at 7th, just barely managing to beat out the Italians and the Dutch. Rounding out the list is Brazil at 1.6 trillion, who purely rely on their own economy since they haven't been changed at all, making the list simply because other nations have disappeared. Let's now compare this to a top 10 list from actual 1939. To prevent people from getting confused about the changed numbers, every GDP figure is in trillions of US dollars, but GDP back then was significantly lower, which is why we work with these decimal points. Well, unsurprisingly, the US still stands heads above the rest, but now followed by the British instead. The 2 Anglo states are so economically dominant, the Soviets come in 3rd with only about half of the UK's GDP, with the Germans having just barely lost to their great communist rival. Japan comes in 5th place, having had the greatest relative drop-off of all from their new position as the 2nd greatest economy. Jumping down quite significantly then, France comes in at 6th, followed by China as the final economy over 200 billion. Italy is next, followed by the Netherlands. The one who's rounding out the list is a surprise contender, as Poland makes the list. Putting these 3 lists next to each other, America's amazing consistency is clear. The increased importance of East Asia as economic hubs are also clear to see by the drop-off in Japan and China on the list. Similarly, the Soviets, which used to be a top 3 economy, are all the way down at 7th now, and Russia themselves don't even make the list on their own. Another amazing fun fact is that Italy remains consistent at 8th, which I think is neat. Doing the same then with population, most people will be familiar with the modern top 10. Now immediately, 5 of these 10 are annexed by others, so clearly this list will significantly change. With our very first nation, our scale completely breaks, as the British have doubled the population of China, our own number 10. Behind Britain are Japan and China, sharing the incredibly high Chinese population, with Japan just barely coming out on top. France, with their massive African empire, jumps to 4th. The United States becomes 5th, but the next one is surprising to me, but makes me as a Dutchman very proud, as the Dutch just barely beat out the Soviets for 6th place. Brazil is next, followed by the 2 new colonial giants, Italy and Belgium, both carried by a single, highly populated colony. Moving the list back to real-life 1939, we of course still start with Britain at 550 million, followed by Japan and China in the same order. Next up is actually the Soviet Union, who just managed to beat out their future rival, the United States. Next up, fascinatingly, the French, with their entire worldwide empire, only barely beat out Germany for population. The Dutch are at 8th, and Italy, ever consistent, remains steady at 9th. The one rounding out the list is once again Brazil, which seems like the eternal wild card for these lists. Looking at the three lists next to each other, the population increase of nations with an African empire is very noticeable, while the population decline of the European states is clear as well. There is little to compare to the real list, since most of these nations have just disappeared. Now to conclude this video, I want to do some calculations comparing the new Axis and allies in various stages of the war without taking occupations into account, since I'd have to spend hours researching for each changed situation. So we will only look at the loyalty of the official government. Comment below if you'd like to see a shorter video diving into the 1942 borders as well. At the start of the war, the Axis actually slightly dominate the Allies, with 34% of the world's economy against only 21% for the Allies. But as the war progresses, more and more states join the war, and they overwhelmingly sided with the Allies. By 1942, the major economies of the US and the Soviets had joined the Allied side. In this situation, the Axis jumped by a massive 2% to 36%, where it would remain for the rest of the war. The Allies, meanwhile, jump up to a massive 54%, securing the majority of the world's economy. The final big jump comes in 1945. With the Axis on the verge of collapse, the Allies announced the creation of the United Nations, and required nations to declare war on Germany to join. Most of the remaining neutral states did, and by the end of the war, the Allies had peaked at around 60% of the world's economy. In terms of population though, the Axis aren't as impressive. They start off at 22% against the Allies, who even in 1939 already have 47% of the world right off the bat. By 1942, this would have developed to 24% for the Axis, while the Allies jump to an impressive 64%. The final jump in 1945 gives the Allies 72% of the world's population. An interesting side note, for the Axis side, the Japanese hilariously dominate the faction, with around 60% of the faction's GDP and around 45% of the population as well. But with that, I am done for today. Let me know if you're interested in the 1942 version of this video. But for now, I will thank you all for watching. Consider leaving a like and a comment to support the content. Subscribe for 2 more videos every single week. To continue watching, click on one of the 2 videos on screen now. Again, thank you all for watching, and goodbye.